Everybody, and welcome to another of my political ideas videos. Today we're going to look at conservatism and in particular conservative views on society. Now there's a lot of variety in conservatism when it comes to society. There's also there's some quite broad areas of continuity. Now some traditional views of conservatism and society focus on localism. So Burke, who's one of the key early conservative writers, talks about society being made up of local communities that he described as little platoons. So these would give people security and status and lead to a sense of community within that area of society. And such ideas, or ideas like these, continued through conservatism through One Nation conservative thinkers such as Oakeshott, who again talked about kind of small communities and this being a kind of an important part of society. However, with the new right, they really champion individualism, and to some extent even question the existence of society as a concept whatsoever. I mean, they talk about family and they talk about individuals, but they don't really deal with society. And in that aspect, the new right is actually closer to liberalism than it is to conservatism in terms of its views on society, with that focus on the individual rather than the wider group or community. Right, so some kind of key ideas about society that we tend to get from conservatism is this idea of society being organic. So that doesn't mean it's being grown without kind of chemical pesticides or fertilizers. Instead, what it really means is that it can't be artificially created. You can't artificially create a society. So the ideas of a utopia that we hear about in liberalism and definitely in socialism are completely dismissed by conservatives in terms of their ideology of society. So they say what happens with a society is it emerges very slowly over time. And it cannot be controlled necessarily, or I mean, to some extent, it can't really be understood. So what makes up that society is kind of difficult to pin down, and that also makes, therefore, the future of society quite difficult to absolutely be certain of. So this then tends to leave you to ask a conservative, well, why do we do things like this? They'll always respond with answers like, well, we just do, because we always have. It is our tradition. That is, it is always done like this. And so there's that kind of unquestioning kind of thing of things coming from the past, and tradition is part of that. But really what this comes down to is that the ideal of society, or the idea of society that conservatives talk about, is they see it more of as a plant, an organic thing, rather than something that can be man-made or created. And because it's like an organic plant or something like that, it's something that has to be kept alive rather than something that would have a clear destination, like a socialist or liberal would talk about. So society doesn't necessarily follow your instructions. So if you change anything, you're not quite sure what the consequences of that are going to be. So you shouldn't change any of the fundamentals, because if you change any of the fundamentals of an organic thing, it dies, you kill it. So really, most things should be left alone. And there will be development and change, but it should be incremental and slow and that. So another way of thinking about this, if you consider a kind of conservative society to be a car, it definitely wouldn't have a sat-nav, because the conservative idea of society is we don't know where it's going. The conservative owner, would be constantly convinced the car was going to break down, and they wouldn't really know how it works. So in this, you can see why conservatives tend to be very cautious, because they see the future as something potentially difficult, dangerous, something to be wary of, and therefore they are particularly worried about change. Now, they accept there will be some change, but anything at all radical will be opposed by conservatives in their view on society. Now, the next bit is about how they look at society, and they look at it using evidence. They talk about empiricism. So rather than talking in ideals, what a conservative says is we should look at is really, how is society? What is society as it is? And then we shall act according to how society is and the norms of society and the way things are done. rather than going, well, actually, it's like this, but we want to make it like that, and start talking about how it should be and what ideally it should be. There's no point talking about what it should be. We deal with the here and now and exactly how it is. Now, that does lead to a degree of cynicism about what we call normative views, what we see in socialism and liberalism, where they talk about how things should be in the future. The Conservatives say, well, we can't really control the future. And what we have to deal with is, in a very pragmatic, evidence-based way, is what we have in front of us. Now, this can ultimately limit the ambition of conservatives when it comes to society. And this then leads to this degree of pessimism, which is in a lot, but not all, of conservative writing, where they're kind of focused on staying afloat, stopping things getting worse. And also, you'll see one of the things you'll see in conservatism is this idea of things degrading, things getting worse than they used to be. And this is because they don't see this working towards an ideal and progression that you'll see in ideologies like liberalism and socialism. Right. So the next part we're going to look at is tradition. And this links to this idea of empiricism, also links to the ideas of an organic society. So the Conservatives say that the traditions and habits of society, the cultural norms, the things that have always been done, are really, really important. And this is part of society being organic and things that shouldn't be and messed around with and changed. And also it's about just looking at society as it is and using the evidence to go, well, this is our society. What best suits our society, rather than having some ideal? So anything that turns away from tradition is likely to risk the future. So the analogy again that's used often on this is the idea that society is organic, according to conservatives. So if you start getting rid of tradition, you're going to cut the plant's roots, in which case the plant might die or will die, and therefore you shouldn't mess with tradition. All changes should be gradual, and we should also always be really mindful of the past. Now, sometimes this leads to conservatives to defend things that you might think that due to other parts of their ideology, it would suit them to change. So one of the things I often think about is in terms of unionism or devolution, then a lot of stuff that's proposed on that, you would think, well, that's going to suit a kind of British Conservative Party to give Scotland greater or full independence, or to devolve more powers. It fits with localism, for example, tradition conservatism. It would suit their political ends in terms of control over England. But because it would go against tradition, then that would be something that the Conservatives would oppose. So sometimes we get this bit with all ideologies where some elements conflict with others. Another element that Conservatives would champion in society is this idea of hierarchy. Now, whilst we see in the other ideologies like liberalism and socialism talk of inequality and removing inequality, conservatives say, well, inequality exists and it should. They say, well, some people will have more resources, more opportunities than other people, and there's no reason to adjust that. So they will see the people in top of society being there for good reason, and they accept that people have power and they have privilege and that other people don't. So whilst liberals and socialists would strive to change that in society to varying degrees, a conservative would just go, that's just how it is and how it should be. Now, this kind of leads to a saying which you might well have seen elsewhere, but this idea of with great power comes great responsibility. So a brand of conservatism, One Nation conservatism in particular, believes that those at the top of the hierarchy should look after those lower down. So they should treat them like a parent would treat their children. So, and this goes back to, for example, in the UK, politicians like Disraeli. And what he wanted to do was he said, well, we're going to prevent all the radical changes and all this other stuff that's been proposed by just looking after those at the bottom, because we've got the wealth and the power and the money and the understanding and the knowledge, so we can just look after them. They don't necessarily all need the vote. They don't necessarily need to turn to radicalism or socialism. We can just give them what they need, make sure it's all done in a sensible way so it doesn't destroy society, and everything will be fine. So think of that as if Boris has talked a lot about One Nation conservatism. So think of like Boris, like a father looking out for all the less fortunate in society, like a good father would, even though not everybody in society is actually one of his children, though quite how many are is maybe still a question that's being asked. The New Right are also happy with inequality, but they're less keen on paternalism. because again we've got that greater individualistic branch. So it kind of breaks the two sides to a degree in terms of traditional view of conservatism, where you've got the inequality but paternalism. With the new right, you've still got the inequality, but you don't necessarily have that paternalistic urge or strand to it. Another kind of key bit of conservative ideology is Judeo-Christian morality, and you'll see an awful lot in conservative ideology and thinking across this country, in Europe and in America, which connect their kind of ideas with religion, particularly kind of Old Testament ideas on morality. So in the last few days, we've seen Trump having protesters cleared so he could go and stand outside a church and hold a Bible, and this would play, or was aimed to play, very strongly to the kind of conservative Christian base in America. And coming out of that ideology, there's this belief that humanity is flawed, and you'll find this in Old Testament teaching, as well as you'll find it in conservative teaching, and therefore that people are in need of instruction, and that they need to be kept in check. Other parts of conservative ideology, which links this kind of morality, you see really strong support for marriage and family values, something that conservative parties in the UK have got themselves in a bit of a muddle with in the past, particularly in the time of Major. Now, there is also in America, there's this really strong connection in the conservative right to this opposition to abortion. Yeah. So again, some looking at some very kind of traditional old-fashioned views. Now, there's also this idea in holding people to account for their actions, and this links in again to a degree with individualism, but it go back to the old kind of tradition and Judeo teaching that actually if somebody does wrong, then that's them. They've done wrong. It's not something you can blame on society like a socialist might. And also they see religion and morality as a way of building society and holding society together. So they see it as a key cornerstone, and often this is linked with the earlier ideas of tradition. In the UK, traditionally, the Conservative voters tended to be Anglican, whilst the Whig or Liberal voters tended to be what were known as non-conformists. They came from either Methodist, Baptist, or other traditions. So we see this connection in the UK between church and state, which is partly tradition and is partly to do with the link with Christian values. Right, another key bit in terms of conservative views on society is to do with property. So property again is linked to tradition and continuity, and the idea is that property can be passed down through generations, also feeding into the ideas of inequality, because obviously you can only hand property down and you can only hand property down of a certain value if you own it. And this tends to be why conservatives tend to get very upset about things like inheritance tax, because that kind of is a block on this tradition of holding property and passing it down through generation. Conservatives also argue that owning property gives people a stake in society and makes them more likely to conform and resist change and to be kind of upstanding citizens. The new right has really shown a kind of clear obsession with the idea of property owning. We're talking about a property owning democracy. We saw this with the right to buy scheme under Thatcher's government, and you'll see it even today in a lot of right-wing press. Things like the Mail and the Express have a complete obsession with house prices and stopping homes being sold to pay for an individual's care later in life. So they have differing views on society amongst conservatives, and if we look at some of them as we go through, so these are some of the stuff from the key thinkers. So Hobbes says essentially society only exists when there is a state to establish order. Burke talks about it being organic and based on these little platoons. Oakeshott continues this idea of local communities being kind of vital to human survival. The new right, then, I mean, if you look at Rand, she actually puts some kind of doubt on the real existence of society and says essentially it's just the sum of all the individuals that live in it. And then again, as the new right ideas continue, we say is kind of geared towards individuals and self-fulfillment. So we are seeing a bit of a split here between the new right and more traditional and one nation conservatism. Right, thank you very much for watching, everybody. Just to reiterate again, this is part of my series looking at political ideas. So you'll find a whole series of videos on liberalism, on socialism. This is part of my series on conservatism, where I go through and look at the core ideas and then go on and look at key individuals as well as the different strands of that particular ideology. So make sure you subscribe so you can find all of them. Please leave me comments, any thoughts, any suggestions, any counter arguments, and I will speak to you all again soon. Thank you very much.